Are you a Bravo-holic who spends hours talking about the Real Housewives with your friends? Do you plan on stopping by something about her the next time you're in LA? Or want to nominate Kyle Richards as your MVP of the year? If so, tune into the podcast Behind the Velvet Rope, where host David Yontef interviews all of your favorite Real Housewives and Bravo celebrities. Plus, he dishes the dirt 7 days a week. That's Behind the Velvet Rope on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Support for This News is So Gay comes from the LGBTQ Plus Opportunity Fund of the Cleveland Foundation, leveraging philanthropy to empower LGBTQ Plus communities. Welcome to This News is So Gay. I'm your host, Ken Schneck, editor of The Buckeye Flame, Ohio's LGBTQ Plus newsroom. Thanks so much for joining us. We interrupt your regularly scheduled LGBTQ Plus Reporters Roundtable to bring you a special edition of our podcast. This is
Extra, extra, read all about it.
Extra Extra is an opportunity to hear more from the individuals who have helped define our field and continue to shape possibilities for the LGBTQ plus media landscape. And this week's guest is no exception. Chris Geidner is the legal mind and the pen behind Dork, the go-to source for legal reporting and analysis about some of the biggest stories of our day, from the Supreme Court to the Trump administration to courts and legislatures all across the nation. For close to 2 decades, Chris, Dork has been keeping us in the know on stories relating to LGBTQ plus issues and criminal justice, but doing so in the most accessible ways that truly inspire a lot of my own work in journalism. His many accolades include multiple awards from NLGJA, the LGBTQ plus Journalists Association, including Journalist of the Year and LGBTQ plus Journalist of the Year. I only got one of those. And he's been awarded with a GLAAD Award for Best Magazine Article, and he's here with us. Chris, thanks so much for chatting with us.
Hello.
So excited to have you here. I must start with, when little Chris Geidner was running around Austintown, Ohio, was being a lawyer always the dream?
Actually, yes, much more so lawyer than journalist. The inevitability of me ending up in law school was pretty much a known factor, probably by like sixth grade or so. I don't think there would have been anybody in my life who was surprised by the fact that I ended up in law school.
In my head, there was a TV lawyer that you idolized. I feel really confident about that. So tell me if I'm wrong.
Not necessarily a TV lawyer, but it was Michael J. Fox on Family Ties is the era that I come from. It would have been late at the time, but remember being allowed to stay up sometimes to watch LA Law. Yeah, so we're starting off. You're forcing me right away from the beginning to age myself. So we're not starting off on a good note.
Mine was Matlock, so I fully own that. I wanted to be Matlock. Can we talk a little bit about growing up LGBTQ plus in the Mahoning Valley? For folks who don't know about that area, what was life like for you there?
I mean, so we will, since we're doing that. I mean, I will say I'm 48, so I graduated from high school in 1995. I mean, it was a not a great time, and it was more a time when you just weren't out.
Mhm.
I mean, certainly not in school, and it was still very much a time when the discussion overwhelmingly about being gay related to HIV/AIDS and or just explicitly anti-gay. And I mean, but it was also at sort of a quickly changing time where there was already sort of amongst the kids this idea that, like, yeah, we're not quite sure that's right. So as I was getting ready to go to college, and in the year before then, I was a part of an organization, Ohio Teen Institute, that worked on drug and alcohol awareness in schools, and there were some out people there, and so I did have the ability to meet out gay adults and even some out gay students over the course of summers working on things with Teen Institute. And so I did come out to a friend who lived across the state, who lived in Tiffin, via letter before I started my senior year of high school. And then, sort of the summer, once I had decided I was going to American University here in DC for college, and the summer before I left, um, I did start coming out to friends, and it was all good, and was not a amongst my largely speech and debate. I was a big OHSSL person
Oh, yeah.
amongst that group, not considered a negative.
I just want to do a programming note for everybody on next week's episode. That Tiffin guy is going to be reading Chris's letter. That's what I think is going to happen. It is kind of an interesting generational thing because I will say Chris Geidner outed his high school graduation year. It is the same as mine. And it's kind of a weird in-between generation because we're a little too young, just by a couple years, to have been heavily impacted by HIV and AIDS, but we're still a couple years ahead of Matthew Shepard's murder, which affected my life so deeply, being in New York City and just kind of living my life there. And so it is kind of this bridge generation for us.
Yeah, no, and I think we're right in, like, the almost, like, half generation that was, like, at least some of our time thinking about the fact that we were gay, even if we weren't out, was, like, even probably pre-AZT.
Yeah.
And that it really was much more of a Ryan White mindset than a Matthew Shepard mindset. And that there, I mean, who obviously wasn't gay, but faced the horrible, just like blatant anti-AIDS related, based in a lot of homophobia as well as othering of drug users, largely those two groups. I think even people who sort of like graduated from high school like in 2000 or afterwards, like I find that sort of, I mean, you're sort of getting into millennials then, that like I think a lot of them came out with an awareness of drug cocktails and stuff, and while it wasn't at all the sort of like manageable chronic disease that people know it is now, they certainly didn't come of age with the death sentence fear
Yeah.
that I think a lot of people, probably like 93 to 98 sort of graduating group, a sort of end Generation X group, grew up with.
I love our little generation. Yes. Well, you decide at some point, all right, I'm going back to Ohio for law school. And I have to tell you, I'm low-key obsessed with your journey as well because I am the only non-lawyer in my family, and I'm the only one who wanted to be a lawyer. I just didn't go that route. I still kind of want to go to law school, and you should probably talk me out of that off the air. The Ohio State Law Journal, in my head, that's like this thing that you don't sleep at all. You are just constantly working at the Law Journal. What's reality like of doing that?
Well, that's law school. I mean, law journal is just something that you add on top of it, and everybody's doing everything. I would say in some ways, like with anything else, it was actually in my second year in law school when I was sort of a junior person on the law journal that I was doing much more of the work. And that's what ended up is why I was the editor of the Law Journal. But I mean, important to my story and to your listeners as well is what was happening there and why that happened that way is that my first year in law school was when the Supreme Court heard and decided Lawrence versus Texas, which overturned sodomy laws that were remaining across the country and reversed Bowers versus Hardwick, which had come about in the height of the AIDS homophobia crisis. It was sort of, I mean, ultimately, when you look back historically, like the worst possible time for that case to have reached the court in the 80s. But so my first year in law school, we had that decision, and that's when I started Law Dork originally. Was because of Lawrence versus Texas and wanting to write about it. That was also the year that Grutter and Gratz came down, which were the two decisions that kept higher ed affirmative action, race conscious admissions alive. That was just recently overturned. And then the second year in law school, Ohio State Law Journal held a symposium that was on Lawrence versus Texas. And so the Law Journal holds this symposium. And because of work that I had done researching with professors, Mark Spindelman and Ruth Kolker in particular, I was sort of the junior person on Law Review who was picked to help with the symposium editor, Patrick, to help run the symposium. And then the way that law journals work, the year that you hold the symposium, the next year you publish the issue of that symposium. So I helped run the actual symposium in my second year, and then I was the editor of the law journal that was going to be publishing that symposium. In some ways, the through line of Lawrence versus Texas ended up being a big part of the through line of my time in law school and then my time at the law journal, which then led me into practice.
How do you describe Law Dork to people who don't know it? And also, who are those people? We don't know those people.
I mean, Law Dork literally, it came out of, I was approaching the end of my first year of law school, and one of my friends, Steve, I was talking with him about essentially how I wanted to be talking about things that were happening at the court. I wanted to be writing about Lawrence versus Texas. Truly in that like 1L first year law student, I figured it out. I know what the law is now that I've had 1.5 semesters of law school.
Done.
I mean, in a lot of ways, it was like ultimate white guy arrogance. Like, okay, I've got it. Let's do this. But also, it was the fact that before law school, I moved home from DC. I was living at home, and I worked at the Tribune Chronicle in Warren, Ohio. And for the like last 6 months before I started law school, I was the editorial writer. So when I was there, I had been doing like daily editorial, right? I was the only editorial writer. Like we'd go into these editorial meetings with the other bigwigs and we'd come out with like 8 or 9 ideas for editorials that I would then like draft over the course of the week. And one day I was like hemming and hawing about and like went to the editor in chief and was basically like, we really didn't come up with a lot of good ideas at the editorial board meeting. And I'm having trouble coming up with an editorial to write today. And he literally physically took me out to the copy desk, which was the olden days. We had like 6 people on the copy desk every night. And he pulled the paper drafts of the proofs of each page. And he was like, I'm responsible for these 47 pages. You're responsible for this one. I don't care what you put in it. It can be all cartoons, but you have to fill that page every day. I have to fill the other 47. I mean, he was kind of a jerk, but it was his way of saying, like, I don't want you to complain about your one page to me ever again. But the lesson that I took was like, I learned about needing to write something every day. And so then I get to law school and I'm telling this friend, Steve, I'm like, I've spent so much time learning how to write well and learning how to like engage constantly with what's going on. I'm going to lose that in law school. And this was early. This was 2002. He's like, "We'll start a blog." And like, I had known a couple of people who had blogs at that point. I had like started following when Josh Marshall started
Oh,
Talking
yeah.
Points memo in large part during the 2000 recount. And so I started Law Dork. I kept that going when I became a lawyer. I had to shut it down when I worked for the state of Ohio for 2 years. But then, as soon as I left working for the AG's office, I relaunched it and then I moved to DC. And when I shut it down, it was when I joined Metro Weekly and was full time there. But then when I restarted it again in 2022, this time via Substack, and it essentially over the course of the last 23 years, I've always done a version of the same thing, which is you're never going to be confused about what my position is in different formats because of where I worked. It's been more or less feeling opinionated. But like even when I was at BuzzFeed, like you weren't confused where I might lie on a given story. But I mean, what I've always said is I always give you all the information and all the sources to figure out what you think for yourself and to challenge me if you think I'm wrong. When I started with the current iteration of Law Dork, it was because the place where I was working, I didn't want to be there when Dobbs came down. I had grown uncomfortable with the leadership. We had different artistic visions for what journalism needed in this moment. And I wanted to be able to write what I thought needed to be written when Dobbs came down. The timing couldn't have been better. I launched on June 21st, 2022, and Dobbs came down, I think, June 24th, 2022. For people who blessedly don't follow the ins and outs of the Supreme Court, June is when all the big decisions come down. It's when they sort of finish their decisions for the term. And so when I go through this year's June decisions, this will be the end of the fourth year of this version of Law Dork, but it will really be I don't even want to say it. It will be 23 years since I started doing this. And then if you count the newspaper, I started at the newspaper in 2000.
Well, we're going to talk about some of those current cases. But first, everyone, you are indeed listening to This News is So Gay. I'm your host, Ken Schneck from the Buckeye Flame, Ohio's LGBTQ plus newsroom. Joining me this week, Chris Geidner of Law Dork. By the by, if you are not subscribed to This News is So Gay, what on earth are you waiting for? Subscribe to This News is So Gay right this very second on your favorite podcasting app so that new episodes automatically make their way to you. So, Chris, June is rapidly approaching. What are some of the cases that we all need to know about that affect our LGBTQ plus lives?
June is rapidly approaching, but we also still in arguments. On April 1st, we have the birthright citizenship executive order oral arguments. And then in the sitting that will be at the end of the month of April, we have oral arguments over the efforts by the Trump administration to immediately cancel temporary protected status for Haiti and Syria, and the effort to cancel temporary protected status in Haiti has come up in Ohio news because there was great concern that was addressed in the arguments at the district court about whether or not, if that went into effect, whether or not DHS would essentially send sort of the squads that have invaded other cities like Minneapolis, Chicago, Portland to Springfield, Ohio, to attempt to quickly deport a lot of the Haitian population there. had obviously become a huge scare tactic from J.D. Vance and then Trump himself during the election. So on the Ohio front, on the Buckeye part of the Buckeye Flame, those arguments are going to be the last week of April. So pay attention to that. The big case that we have coming up, we had arguments all the way back in October, but we have no decision on the conversion therapy ban. So there's going to be these questions about whether or not Colorado's effort to protect against conversion therapy is upheld. It did not go well for Colorado at the arguments. It is expected that they will strike that down. That is a First Amendment case. It is not a case over the equal protections clause. Protection clauses applicability to sexual orientation or gender identity. Depending on how the decision is issued, it could have significant effects on how states are able to regulate, in particular, mental health treatment and other treatment that is primarily accomplished through speech, as opposed to, say, surgical
Right.
treatment. The other big case is the case over trans sports bans, and that will raise these equal protection questions, although it could, similar to how the Supreme Court handled the case last term over Tennessee's ban on gender affirming care for trans minors, could attempt to do what Chief Justice Roberts did there, which I think will not stand the test of time and will eventually be looked at as a really horrifying decision, to essentially say that that banning something based on medical diagnoses, medical treatment, medical procedures, medical biological sex is not the same thing as discriminating on the basis of transgender status. And so they could attempt to sort of sidestep the ultimate question. But if you keep sidestepping it, eventually you're saying, like, we don't care about it. That most notably came up recently outside of the Supreme Court in a case out of West Virginia over the state's Medicaid rules excluding coverage for gender affirming surgery for trans adults. So it was not a trans minors case. There was the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. In deciding that case, the court is a majority. Appeals courts are like somewhere between, like, some of them are as few as 9, as many as 27 judges, but generally only a 3-judge panel hears the case. And even though the Fourth Circuit is still a majority Democratic appointees, for some reason this case randomly got assigned to 3 Republican appointees, including 2 Trump appointees, and they issued a really scary decision that essentially said, even though the Tennessee case was very much about the age and the fact that this was minors, the fact that the state can treats children's medical practices differently. This judge on the Fourth Circuit wrote an opinion that was essentially Judge Julius Richardson wrote this opinion that was basically dropped a footnote and said, like, yeah, I know that Supreme Court case was just about children, but no reason why it couldn't apply to adults. And here's a few random sources I've chosen on my own to justify that. And there is an effort to have the full Fourth Circuit review that case, and I think that they very well might. Even though that's not before the Supreme Court this term, that case, if it's not overturned and it does continue to apply, could quickly become the most important case for the future of how trans people are going to be treated in the law. So even though it's not one of those two Supreme Court cases this term, I think it is important for people to be aware of before it even gets to the Supreme Court.
So much to cover. Well, last question for you, sir. We have a weekly segment here called Glitter Bomb. And Glitter Bomb is where we ask our panelists to spotlight something around queer joy in their work. And you're covering some really tough cases, especially right now for the LGBTQ plus community and in many ways against the LGBTQ plus community. Chris Geidner, tell us where you are finding queer joy in this work.
I find queer joy in two main ways in my work. The real way is getting to know the plaintiffs who are bringing these
Mm,
lawsuits, the reasons why they're doing it. I mean, I mentioned his name. Like, if I saw James Dale at something, like, we would immediately like say hi to each other. I got to know covering marriage. I got to know so many of the marriage plaintiffs. I mean, before she died, got to know Edie Windsor really well, got to know Derek Kitchen along with Moody Spiti, the Utah marriage plaintiffs, and got to know plaintiffs who have brought a lot of the key trans cases and also the lawyers behind that. And the lawyers both in litigation and in academia who are thinking about these issues, thinking about what we do next, thinking about how we move on from this. When I talked about like Robert's decision in Scrimeti being like a decision that is not going to stand the test of time, it's because I know that there are already people thinking about how to
right.
get rid of that. And so that's the first answer. The second answer is that I also consider a part of my job and life is that it's not just reporting, it's the entire written, creative, spoken, sung artistry, all of the creative written work. And I'm a big theater person and I'm going to be in New York this weekend and going to see Jesse Tyler Ferguson being Truman Capote
Oh,
and
yeah.
in his show True. Going to be seeing later this month, I'm going to be seeing Andre DeShields in Cats the Jellicle Ball. Getting all of those queer voices in my mind is essential to balancing out the work that I have to do sitting in a courtroom with Sam Alito many, many more hours than I ever wanted to do.
Well, listeners, if you are not reading Law Dork, you have to. You absolutely have to. It keeps us informed, but in the most accessible way. It can be found at lawdork.com. And that accessibility is what I'm just so appreciative, Chris. Look, I teach higher ed law and I struggle with understanding so many of these cases and the way that you present them with a positionality, which I appreciate because I actually think that the way that you offer forth yourself in these write ups gives us an entry point to understand the cases even more. I said it at the start. I will say it here at the close. It truly has enabled so much of my work in journalism. I'm so appreciative for everything that you're doing out there.
Well, thank you. It is truly an honor to get to do it. The fact that I have been so lucky I mean, the only reason I'm able to do what I'm doing now is because I had so many teachers, I had so many good bosses, I had so many good editors when I was with bigger publications and have just been taught so much over time. But like, I mean, it was the fact that like back when I was in Youngstown and going to the Millennium March on Washington. It literally, I emailed Evan Wolfson at Lambda, who was getting ready to argue a Supreme Court case, and was like, hey, you met me once when I was like an intern at HRC at a luncheon. I'm going to be coming up, and I like the law, and I wasn't even a law student at that point. I was like, I might go to law school in the future. And is there any way that, are you doing anything around the case that I'd be able to? And he was like, yeah, you can come to this luncheon afterwards. And it is that willingness that I've had from people like Evan, people like Richard Socarides, who was the gay and lesbian liaison in the Clinton White House for better or worse, and we do not have a friendly relationship at this point. But Andrew Sullivan was a big part of my early time in journalism, and it was his work and Josh Marshall's work that sort of like were my model when I started Law Dork. And all of those people and Josh, there were even straight people who really did provide an opening for me to be able to do this work. And so I love being able to be there now. And I know that you have spoken with Joe previously, who's at the Blade. But yeah, so I'm so glad that you are doing your work in Ohio, that we do have people still in DC doing this work, and that anybody who can, there is obviously a paid option, and I love paid subscribers at Law Dork, but there is a free option because I do want to make sure that my work is accessible to as many people as possible.
Well, thank you. And we should clarify that shout out was to Joe Reber-Kenny of the Washington Blade, who on a previous episode not only hate crimed me, but also you, Chris Geidner, when he talked about a classic. He used the word classic LGBTQ plus film, and he made it sound like it was from the 1920s, and he was talking about Trick. Anyway, Chris Geidner is the brains and the pen behind Law Dork. You can read everything he's doing at lawdork.com. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks.
Again, I'm Ken Schneck, editor of The Buckeye Flame, and if you liked this episode of This News is So Gay, please share it with a friend. Subscribe so that you do not miss out on our next episode. Send an email on over to editor@thebuckeyeflame.com. That's me, to let us know your thoughts, and rate and review us on your favorite podcasting app. It really makes a difference. This News is So Gay is a product of The Buckeye Flame, a nonprofit newsroom. Become a recurring donor for as little as $12.50 a month, which truly enables programming just like this from our scrappy queer newsroom. In the meantime, read LGBTQ plus news, share the stories of LGBTQ plus reporters, and support the work of LGBTQ plus newsrooms. Until next week, friends.